Hello, art historians, and welcome to one of the last two lectures we're going to have for first semester, where we start tiptoeing into the beginning of the actual Renaissance period. Now, when we last left, we were looking at the Proto-Renaissance. So that's kind of like the first go around or first steps towards the Renaissance with Giotto. And he was kind of like that bridge between Gothic and Renaissance. But now we're really going to see moving forward into the rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas in Europe, which is going to lead to a rebirth in the art that goes with it. So when we talk about the Renaissance, I really can't stress this enough. Everybody focuses on Renaissance art, and they seem to forget the fact that Renaissance art was the result of the rebirth of ideas that returned into Europe after they had basically fallen off when Rome collapsed. So the major ideas that we're going to see return are things like humanism, this idea that humans are just as important as God is. Of course, whenever Greece and Rome had it, it was the idea that they were important as the gods, but now we're making this fit with actual Christianity. And the idea being that if God made humans, then therefore humans must also be beautiful. And if humans have talent, then it is a sin against God to waste that talent, and humans should try to understand this world that they've been given. So kind of putting more the emphasis here on earth than necessarily in heaven. So we're also starting to see this renewed idea of rationalism and doing things that make sense. And that's going to translate into the art in a way of doing things and showing things that make sense. It doesn't make sense to not show art realistically just because the Romans did it. If they're truly Christian, then it is totally okay for them to do this and show art and appreciate the human body the way that it should be, because God made it and it's the vessel for the soul, which is kind of an Aristotelian idea. So when we talk about Renaissance art, we're talking about art that reflects these new ideas. Actually, they're not new, they're just being reborn. And that's what the Renaissance is. It's a rebirth, all right? So now, okay, we're going to need to really focus on the fact that the Renaissance did not start in Rome. So we think of, the rebirth of Greece and Roman ideas, but it's actually not going to start in Rome. So this is just a kind of reminder of what we were talking about earlier, all right, is that Greek and Roman cultures had this idea of rationality, all right? So rationality is doing things based on what makes sense and not on faith and not on belief and not just because we've always done it. It has to be because it makes sense, all right? And there has to be a good reason for it. And that the world can be studied and understood away from faith. Like there are explanations for things that can be done away from actually faith. So humanism is also going to return, which we've already kind of talked about, so I won't spend a whole lot of time there. So Greek and Roman architecture is going to come back. Why? Because we're studying Greek and Roman rationality. We're studying their ideas of perfection. And remember, the Parthenon was designed to be like so perfect that it wasn't even possible. So we're going to see this emphasis again on trying to make things look perfect. And one of the reasons for that is it did show still that connection with Christianity, because if humans could create something so perfect, it showed the perfection of God in creating those humans. So it all really did tie back to religion, but it emphasized the human role that was in it. So if you're going to be celebrating Greek and Roman ideas, it's only natural that the architecture is going to reflect that. So you can see right here, for example, this is a Renaissance work, and you can see that they're using Roman architecture. In fact, this is actually in it's a very biblical scene. It's the angel showing up to tell Mary she's pregnant, and here they are sitting inside what looks to be like a Roman villa or on a Roman porch outside of a home. So why Italy? Of all the places where the Renaissance is going to be reborn, why are these ideas reborn in Italy? So number one, Italy is mainly the key returning point from the Crusades. So whenever people first came back from the Crusades and their exposure to the Byzantine and Islamic world, the first place they're really going to experience is Italy, because it was kind of everybody's port at the time, because Venice did pay for so much shipping, and Florence was actually bankrolling a lot of this and was loaning money to a lot of these people. So Italy is going to be the place where these ideas really came back to. Not to mention, in Italy, they already had a lot of Greek and Roman texts that were there from whenever the Roman Empire was around, because the closer you were to Rome, the less likely those were destroyed. So they already had the ability to pick that up. And a lot of people in Italy could speak Latin. It was an intelligent language. So it was easy for them to start picking up reading these texts again in Greek and Latin without having to wait for the translation. Though then there were wealthy families. So like in Florence, for example, there were the Medici, and the Medici were not one of these families that was using feudalism during the Middle Ages. They were all about banking. So therefore they already had the funds. They were loaning money to the Pope even. And as a result of this, they had enough money to spend money on books and do the reading and patronize artists to show things that had Greek and Roman mythology and Greek and Roman ideas in it. And these guys paid for a lot of those artists, and the Medici family are going to be around for quite a long time. So they're going to patronize everybody from the early Renaissance all the way through the late Renaissance. Michelangelo was a huge person who received a lot of money from them. Also, these families like the Medici, they could get away with what a lot of places would have considered heresy because of what they were reading and what they were studying and a lot of the paintings they were asking for. And that's because they had basically loaned money to the Pope. So therefore nobody was really going to mess with them if they wanted to, paint, a sculpture of, a nude female or a nude male. Another thing in this is Italy is not what we think of as Italy today. Italy used to be comprised of a large number of city-states. And those city-states competed with each other before they became Italy as one country. So being able to show that you had the best artists, the best architecture in your city was kind of a competition to bring people into your city. So the Medici are going to be a huge part of the Renaissance, mainly because they were all about understanding those Greek and Roman texts and those ideas and those beliefs and those philosophies. They kind of broke away from the monopoly that the church held over people's thinking, because the church controlled everybody's hearts and minds in medieval Europe. And they could control people to the point of thinking that the only way they could get into heaven in the next life is by doing exactly what the church said. And so the church was very adamant about not having works of art that showed off talent of artists. And basically, if the Greece and Rome did it, then they were not going to do it. So during the Middle Ages, you would never see pagan gods or idols or nudity, and everything was deliberately stylized and not naturalized to kind of make sure you weren't A, doing what the Greeks and Romans were doing, but B, that you weren't guilty of idol worship. But the church had really started to lose a lot of face at this time. They couldn't win the Crusades. They couldn't stop the Black Plague. They had at one point had 3 popes. There was a lot of corruption in the church because people were buying positions into the church who couldn't even read. And people started to really turn away from the church to find other answers to the meaning of life. And the Medici were a good example of that they also saw the fact that they were educated in Greek and Roman ideas as suddenly showing that it was a reflection of their wealth because they had the ability to read these books. So intelligence was actually wealth during this time. And what better way to reflect what you knew than visibly through the art and architecture that you created and the artists that you patronized, all right? So Florence is going to be the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance. And one of the reasons for that is Rome had been abandoned. At one point, the Pope had actually moved to Avignon in France, and Rome had kind of been this place under constant attack for a while. So really, a lot of the artists and everybody that would have been working in Rome had kind of taken off. They had left and gone to other places. And Florence, being a place of very wealthy bankers, was a place where artists would go to try to find work and patrons who would pay for them to do works of art. So you have this area in Italy where the artists were flocking to because this was a place for them to actually get a job and have opportunity because these were educated people other than the church who could actually pay for them to create, works of art and architecture. So Florence kind of saw this as an opportunity to not only, see Greek and Roman art reborn, but to do better and to show how advanced they were and how progressive they were by showing things from history and mythology, that they had this awareness of things that went on 1,000 years ago that a lot of people didn't know. So there's actually going to be a kind of a fun story that kickstarts what we know as the Renaissance, and it happens and I'll click ahead and come back. So this is the Cathedral of Florence, all right? And if you go to Italy today, Florence, this is a must-have stop. You've got to go there and see this. And this actual church was, at that time, typical Romanesque church. It is not Gothic. It has the three parts to it, where it's got the basilica, the bell tower, which, by the way, the bell tower was actually designed by Giotto, who we've talked about, and the baptistry. So directly in front of us right here is the baptistry. So they had a competition for the baptistry right here in front to create, the winner would create a series of doors for this, and it would be great fame and a great paycheck for them. So they gave everybody wanting to enter a challenge. So what they had to do was do within this little Gothic style symbol right here, they had to do the scene of Abraham getting ready to sacrifice Isaac. All right. So this style, what you can see right here, is both these panels. So you have Brunelleschi and you have Ghiberti. All right. And Brunelleschi and Ghiberti, when they did this, are both, if you notice, kind of using a sense of drama that looks a little bit Hellenistic. They're using wet drapery look that kind of shows Greece. But the winner of this is going to be the one that truly showed the most realistic depiction, the most human version of this scene. And this is the one that won. This is going to be Ghiberti. And if you look in this scene, he's using a contrapposto stance for Abraham. Isaac is a nude male. He's standing on what looks like a sarcophagus, like the Roman style sarcophagus. It is a very dramatic scene. There's foreshortening in it. There's a lot of movement, and this won it. And it kind of showed that the tastes of Europe were moving towards, and especially in Italy, were moving towards the ancient Greek and Roman time. And this is what the fashion was for the time. And so Ghiberti won the doors for the gates of paradise that are on the front of the baptistry today. And you can see here on the left, those were the ones that he created. But that actually freed up Brunelleschi to do something even more famous, because the Medici during this time, Florence had actually been hit by the plague. Florence was suffering very, very badly. And Lorenzo de' Medici decided that one of the ways to get people back on his side and support his family was to give people a bunch of jobs and to show that they were true Christians. So what he actually did is commissioned the building of this dome that you can see right here. And this was the first true dome, true actual Roman style dome to be created since ancient Rome. And it was a huge task, because you can see where the dome sits was on this huge drum of a base where they couldn't find any trees far enough to span across this to build an actual roof. So they needed to build this dome that actually has rib vaulting on the outside to help support it and hold it up. But this was the largest dome ever created, and Brunelleschi was actually able to do that. And he's more famous for that dome than Ghiberti is for the doors. So there's actually, you can see it right there. That's Brunelleschi's dome. Fun fact, Giotto, like I mentioned earlier, so you can see here the bell tower, right? He's actually going to be the one that designs the campanile for this. So he's still an active part of this at the time. And that was pretty typical of a Renaissance master, is they weren't typically good at just one thing. They usually could paint and sculpt and be an architect as well. Now, here's another crazy thing about this. Brunelleschi, while he doesn't get the job, all right, to do the doors, but that did free him up to be able to do something that changed Renaissance art forever. And that is the development of linear perspective, all right? Linear perspective is the ability to create a three-dimensional appearance on a flat surface. It is impossible to create something that is 3D. People are three-dimensional. Like we have depth, we have width. But it's impossible to do that on a flat surface with a fresco, like on a wall. So you have to figure out how to use optical tricks in order to create depth and make it look three-dimensional into the scene. Now, Greece and Rome had kind of started with this, with atmospheric perspective, which means that it gives it the perspective of depth. But Brunelleschi is going to be the first person to apply mathematical or linear perspective in painting, which realistically could create a 3D appearance on a dimensional surface. And we're going to look at this more when we talk about Da Vinci and we get into the High Renaissance. But basically, you start with a horizon line, right? So across that, and you find a vanishing point of where your scene is going to vanish into, that kind of becomes your focal point. And then you use orthogonal lines within the painting that point towards that vanishing point, and it helps to give it depth. All right. Now, one of the first major artists that they didn't include on the 250 who uses this in painting is going to be Masaccio. And I still cannot believe Masaccio is not included on the 250 for this exam. I mean, he's groundbreaking in terms of what he did. So here is what it does, okay? The idea was that you were going to create a picture plane that would be as if you were looking out through a window. All right, so that's kind of the idea, that here's the picture plane, and by looking into it, you are looking out. So naturally, objects that are farther away are going to be smaller, and if they're closer to you, they are going to be bigger. All right, so if you look right here, all right, this is Masaccio's Holy Trinity, which is not on the 250, but you can see that what they did is they created the horizon line, all right, and then they created a vanishing point going into the distance, and the lines even up here in the barrel vault all point towards that vanishing point, and the lines up here in the columns also point towards that vanishing point, which is almost like right at Jesus's head, so that he's the focal point. So now everything kind of points towards that and gets either bigger or smaller so that it actually has depth to it. Okay, so let's take a look at one of the paintings that they do have for the 250, all right? And this is Madonna and Child with two angels, okay? So what we want to look at is, if we're looking at a Renaissance painting, right, what makes it past, what makes it present, and what makes it new, okay? So, or futuristic even. So let's look at this for a second. We have a past event. We have Mary, right, with Jesus with two angels. That is a past scene. Right, so that's not new. Mary is shown as the seat of holy wisdom with Jesus on her lap. That is not new, that is past. What is present about it? Well, what is present is the way that they are showing the scene. Mary suddenly looks like a young woman. She's definitely Florentine, because back then a hot thing to do would be to actually have women have their foreheads plucked to about like here. That was considered fashionable, like having a 5 head basically. And the baby actually looks like a chubby little baby. And then you have two angels who are here, right, that are holding up the baby, which obviously isn't realistic. But notice the fact that we're starting to see Mary, she's shown in the present, right? So that is, they're shown in a present scene. She's dressed like a Florentine lady, very, very wealthy, deep purple. She's got very soft hands, very soft complexion. Her hair is done in a Florentine style. But, all right, what we have here also are new techniques of showing this. So for example, there is a lot of depth in this, all right? There is actual scene in the background outside the window that looks far away. She's obviously the focal point, so she's bigger and she's in closer. You can see humanism that is from the past, but it's returning. It's that natural appearance of how a person would look. An angel looks like a real little boy here, and Jesus looks like a real baby, and Mary looks like a real woman. And yes, she has a halo, but that scene is very, that halo is very thin. It's not a thick surrounding halo. It's just a very thin halo. So kind of moving towards that naturalism a little bit. And then in the background, you can see the scene of modern day Florence, which would be recognizable to the person. So it's that practice of putting a past scene in a present location. So it kind of shows in this that this Madonna, right, she's a material girl. And if you get this, thank you very much for making me not feel terribly old. She's got jewelry on. She's got a nice little headdress on. She's wearing very wealthy clothing, very heavy dark purple. She's got a seat there next to her with a purse and probably jewels in it. So it's showing that this was, as her importance in the past would be because she gave birth to Jesus. But in the Florentine world, an important lady would be dressed like this. So she's not shown like we've seen Mary before as like a peasant, basically. She's shown as a wealthy woman in Florentine society. All right. So this is actually Madonna and Madonna and Child with two angels by Fra Filippo Lippi. All right. And I do want to make this perfectly clear that how art is going to depend on this time is really going to depend on the artist and their own individual background. So that is something completely new, because during the Middle Ages, Mary is always going to be shown the same way, in the same fashion, in the same appearance. But now these artists are able to go, you know, I want to show Mary in this way. This is how I interpret her. This is how I feel that she would look, or this is how I feel it's okay that she would look. So for example, Sandro Botticelli, who we are going to talk about, did work for the church, but he also worked for the Medici. So that's going to impact what he paints and how he paints. So for example, Sandro Botticelli's works of art in the Sistine Chapel don't look anything like he would do for the Medici, who have their own tastes of how they want to see the artwork look. Now, Fra Filippo Lippi, all right, was the teacher of Sandro Botticelli, all right, and this is kind of an important part of the story. And Fra Filippo Lippi was a monk, all right, and this is kind of a crazy part of the story, but he was women obsessed. Like he was such a ladies' man, and it was basically said by the Medici that if they wanted him to complete a work for them, they had to lock him in a room away from all women, because if he saw a pretty girl outside the window, he was going outside the window. Now, he was obsessed with this nun called Lucrezia, right, and which is a very popular name back then, and he had to paint her. So apparently he got Lucrezia to be able to come and sit for him while he painted her. And then he kidnapped her and basically kept her with him, and they had a child together. So it actually could be that in this scene, he based, because he thought Lucrezia was so beautiful, he based this Mary, this Madonna, off of Lucrezia, and one of the children or the angels or the baby is inspired by the child that they had together. And he would basically say, he's like, I have a passion that drives me. I'm lit up from the inside, but it's not a spiritual passion. It's a passion for beautiful women. Like, I find the beauty of God in them. All right. So he is a religious artist. He's a monk, for God's sakes, but he doesn't really paint like a monk. Like, he's basically painting Mary here as a beautiful woman and uses the scene as an excuse to do that. Now, so on the left is Fra Filippo Lippi. On the right is going to be Sandro Botticelli. And Botticelli is going to be the student of Fra Filippo Lippi. And you can see here, if you look at the woman in both pictures, their features are very, very similar. And that may be because Sandro Botticelli learned to paint females from working with Fra Filippo Lippi. So therefore, as a result, a lot of the appearance of Sandro Botticelli's works are going to appear the same way as Fra Filippo Lippi as far as the women's faces. However, Sandro Botticelli, it really is going to depend on who he's working for in terms of what he's going to show. And even though he is a man of the church, I told you he does have paintings in the Sistine Chapel, he's also going to paint things like this. All right. And this is the birth of Venus, all right? It's a very, very famous painting. It shows up all over the place. And Sandro Botticelli was asked to paint this by the Medici, who love mythology. Their knowledge of mythology in their mind showed their wealth because they could afford the luxury of learning about this and studying about this. So you have Aphrodite, or Venus, who's being born from the ocean. She's born from the water, from sea foam. And you have somebody coming to cover her up, and then you have the winds, blowing her basically into being born. And it was a shocker to people because it's like, wow, that's a renewal from the past. That is a nude Greek statue, very much like the Venus de Milo or the Aphrodite of Knidos, where the nudity is not blatant. She's covering her lady bits with her hair, which is something that would have been very common in Greece as well. And the nudity was like, well, she just was born. So, of course, she would be naked if she was just born. So rationality, they were like, there's a rational explanation for this. And you can see she's standing in a contrapposto stance with her hair blowing around her. So the Medici, all right, were like, we want this painting, but we don't want it as a fresco like you've been doing. We want it as a painting on canvas so that we can hang it in our homes or wherever it is that we wanted. And they paid, and Botticelli would have been like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I work for the church. But the Medici were like, no, this is okay. We're going to explain. Plus we will pay you for it. All right. Now he is not as naturalistic as his master is. So let's go back to this. All right. Whoops, wrong direction. Fra Filippo Lippi was definitely going for naturalism in this, whereas Botticelli's not going for as natural, so that it could definitely appear to be a mythological scene, almost a little bit more like a cartoon, all right? So how did they get away with this? This was like, how are you going to get away with showing a nude woman and telling a story from ancient Greece? There is in no way, shape, or form this was religious. And the Medici played on a new idea called Neoplatonism. This is a very important term for you guys to know. Neoplatonism was basically a way to reconcile Greek and Roman ideas and rationality and mythology and every idea that came from Greece and Rome with Christianity. It's how do we make these two things go together in a way that's okay. So for example, she's standing here and there are violets, okay? And violets are all over this. They're on the dress, they're on the ground, and violets are a symbol of modesty. So the idea was that, wait a minute, Mary was very modest, and Mary is the example of divine love and sacrifice. So in this case, Aphrodite represents Mary. So it's okay because it's showing her innocence, and the nudity is okay because it's not sexual. It's a reference into her birth, all right? And basically with the birth of Mary came the birth of love and beauty. And so Aphrodite represents that. And they got away with it because they basically made Greece and Rome work together, right? And you can definitely see it's that renewal of the past, the contrapposto stance, this very fluid lines, Venus kind of looking like Aphrodite of Knidos, or the, early, late classical nude Greek statues. So the idea was stop focusing on the nudity. Stop. It's not that she's naked. She's being born, and with her is coming the birth of divine love. It's not just physical love, it's divine love. And look, they're coming to cover her up. So it's not like she's just standing there, all right? She's coming to, be covered up in something. Okay, so then we're going to see another example of this, all right? So another example of Christianity meeting classicism. That's what Neoplatonism is. It's Christianity meets classical. How do you make these two things work together? And that's classical ideas and classical art. So this is the David, which was a very popular figure in Florence. And the reason for that is the fact that Florence was a very small city-state who basically beat everyone that came towards them. They could take everyone, and it's because they had so much money, they could afford a very powerful military, they could afford a powerful militia. So David, who was a small boy who beat a giant, was kind of like the mascot of Florence. They loved David. And the Medici, Lorenzo de' Medici, actually asked for this sculpture to be done by Donatello, who was around and actually did compete in the contest for the doors of the baptistry, of Florence Cathedral. This right here is the David by Donatello, and this was striking to people because this was the first time that a fully nude, bronze, life-size statue in the round, meant to be seen from all angles, had been created since antiquity, since Greece and Rome. And it was shocking. Now, to be fair, it wasn't supposed to be shown in public. It was supposed to be for private viewing in the Medici home. But the people of Rome, their enemies, actually found out about this and actually kind of used it to say that they were blasphemous and they were evil. But the Medici had an answer for this, right? So number one, Donatello is definitely celebrating the fact that this guy isn't just nude, he's naked. How do you know that? Because in order to draw your attention to that he's not wearing anything else, he's wearing boots and a hat, okay? So when people, and it's a Florentine hat and military boots, so that's a Florentine style hat that David definitely wouldn't have been wearing back then. David is standing there with a sword. He's standing on Goliath's head, if you can see that, like he's basically conquered and vanquished them. So why the nudity? And why does David look like a young, feminine boy? Well, he was. They were made to make it, it was deliberately chosen by the patrons that this is how they wanted David seen. And the reason for this is the nudity shows the vulnerability and, basically how young this boy was, all right? And his face looks young, and he has long curls because he wouldn't have cut his hair yet. And it's this idea of, by making David look younger and almost feminine, that it makes his, what am I trying to say? It makes his accomplishment of beating Goliath even more impressive. Because if David is shown as like this strong, strapping, well-developed, muscular man, then okay, sure, of course he could beat Goliath. But if he's shown young and effeminate and vulnerable, but still holding a sword and able to conquer this man, this beast, and is standing on his head, then that shows something even greater. And why the Florentine hat? Because it basically represents that David is like Florence. And it's also that practice of putting a past event in a present setting, if you will. So again, the David was this return of life-size sculpture and using that Neoplatonism of making classicism work with Christianity. It was okay that it just showed David's vulnerability, and he's got that contrapposto stance, almost effeminate, and it makes what he did conquering Goliath seem even more impressive. All right. And again, David is the mascot for Florence. He's shown in all different kinds of ways. All right. So that nudity does show he's like a god, and because God created him, but at the same time, he's not a well-developed male, or he's still a youth, right? Which is going to show this. So Cosimo de' Medici and then Lorenzo de' Medici having this particular sculpture kind of made people of Florence point fingers at them, but they had a really good explanation for why they had it. Now, we're not just going to see this renewal in art, we're also going to see this in architecture as well. And we can see this, one, by looking at this work of art right here. This is it's by Alberti, I believe. I don't have it written down. But you can see right here that this is a church. So now we're even starting to see religious buildings that don't look Roman-like. They look like they're from ancient Rome now, right? Because the Greeks and the Romans could create these perfectly balanced circular and square combined buildings that showed perfect symmetry and mathematical perfection, which, just like the Parthenon, returning that idea that rationality and understanding shows the perfection of understanding God and the perfection of God himself. So to talk about this, we have to look at the perfectly proportioned Pantheon parody in the Potsy Chapel. All right. And yes, I did all of that alliteration on purpose. All right. So the Potsy Chapel is actually going to be built for a family that's kind of like a mafia war enemy to the Medici. The Pazzis hated the Medici. In fact, it's going to be, at one point, they tried to take out a hit on almost the entire family. They both tried to take each other out multiple times, all right? So they actually brought in one of the best architects of the time. Why did they do this? Because Brunelleschi had done the dome of the Cathedral of Florence for the Medici. So they're like, well, fine, we're going to get the same architect and he's going to do a work of art for our own private chapel. All right. So this Potsy Chapel, right, which is a smaller place of worship, is actually built next to the church of Santa Croce in Florence. And you can see it butts up right next to it, which is a Romanesque style church. And then here you have this new movement away from it, going towards this classical style of rationalism and perfection. It's apparently mathematically proportionate. It is absolutely perfect. All right. It's a tomb for the Potsy family, and it's a little study area for the monks. So it's kind of like a gift to the church, but it's also for the Patsys themselves. Everything about this is supposed to be that idea of perfection in terms of how it is balanced, in terms of how it's designed. It's mathematically perfect. There is the circle and square that can fit inside of each other and also be separate. So kind of showing that just like a building can be perfectly rational, so can God. Humans can create something perfect because God made them, and God is perfect. Okay? So it's that idea of Greek geometry with kind of a Greek temple front a little bit, and then there's a Roman dome over it, right? So kind of like this idea of modeling the Pantheon, this whole idea of what the Pantheon was for. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so the idea of this is we can see that idea of Neoplatonism again, because how are you going to take, because everything that that man emphasized is this was all about the idea of Greek perfection, because this building could reflect the perfection of God and the perfection of the humans who created it, because it is geometrically perfect. It's not like the Pantheon, where the Pantheon is so perfect it's not possible, where it had to be distorted. This uses math to be perfectly geometrically proportionate. Like it is perfect, not contorted, not bent, nothing. Notice for the fact that the columns right here, they're not even true columns. Like they are pilasters into the wall, which are non-supportive, because that way you didn't have to worry about how the eye would see them or the curvature or anything like that. You could make them physically possible. Plus it references back to Greece and Rome with the Corinthian capitals up at the top of it. So this is that idea of Neoplatonism, where classical meets Christianity, this idea of how can you get away with referencing so much pagan Greek past? Well, you say the idea that this church is geometrically perfect, which means that the people who created it understood perfection, and it represents the perfection of God himself. And you can see that there's the Church of Santa Croce right there, which is Romanesque. And then you can see just over the top of it, the arrow's a little bit off, but let me go back. There you can see just the top of the Potsy Chapel right there off to the side of it, kind of showing this, that they were in the know, like with this new movement at the time. This may also have, so again, it may have early been this idea that the Potsy Chapel would be the tomb of the Potsys, but they're not actually buried there. So the Potsy family, like the Medici, like to show off their status and wealth. And remember, knowledge could show your wealth and your status. So the knowledge of ancient Greece, ancient Roman techniques, being able to bring in a famous architect would reflect their wealth as well. And at one point, these were the rivals who actually tried to take a hit out on Lorenzo de' Medici, who was one of the great Medici leaders at one time. So this church was altruistic, meaning it was supposed to be benefiting the church, but it also gave them power, very similar to what we saw with the Arena Chapel that Giotto painted the frescoes on the inside. Now, religious architecture is not going to be the only thing that's going to be a big deal in Italy. We're also going to see domestic architecture become a new thing, kind of like we saw with, we had all this amazing architecture in Rome, and then we see the Roman villas who kind of take a page out of that book, and like the villas at Pompeii and Herculaneum, like the House of the Veti and the House of the Faun. So in the city where these wealthy people were living, like the Medici and the Potsy, they wanted their homes to also reflect their knowledge of the classical past, to show that they had the time and the ability and the wealth to have that kind of knowledge and be tutored in such things. So what we're going to start to see is this architecture of domestic homes is going to reflect the rebirth of Greece and Rome as well. Now, Florence, because they are so commonly either marched through or invaded, there was a city mandate, kind of like in Pompeii, that you didn't show your wealth on the outside of your home. The outside of your home should be masculine and strong and simple and convey a message, whereas the interior, like the Roman villas, could be very elaborate and over the top, where you could invite people in so as not to flaunt your wealth on the outside. So if looking back to what building could be the inspiration for this, naturally the Colosseum came to mind. So this is the Palazzo Medici, right? So, and Palazzo means actual palace, and you can still see these in Florence if you go there today. And this was designed to copy the 3-story levels of the Colosseum. So you can see on the outside, it's very, very simple. There's really not much that's very fancy about this, but it does have the 3 levels. And then up at the top, you have basically a cornice and an entablature at the top, kind of like a temple at the same time. So all of this, and then at the very bottom, that rough exterior is called rustication. And the whole idea of looking rustic or rough, so kind of like rustic wood, like it hasn't been sanded or, smoothed down, that was meant to convey power and be very rough and tough and kind of show, this was a masculine type of family. But then here's the interior, which would be open in the interior, just like Roman villas that we saw at Pompeii and Herculaneum. This is what that would look like. And you can see the mosaics on the ground. You can see the interior fountain that would catch rainwater. You can see the trees, the orange trees. You can see all of this garden on the inside. And then you could have access to the rest of the house through that basically the atrium. This is another open air atrium within these homes. And you can see that that's very similar to what we would see in the Roman villas, where we'd have that peristyle hall, or that, row of columns around it, where here you would have the different entrances to different rooms, and you could have classical works of art and ways to show off your wealth in these homes. This is kind of a fun fact that inside the Palazzo Medici, Hitler and Mussolini actually dined together, because Mussolini was a big fan of the arts and restoring Greek and Roman greatness. He actually had the Auripices Augustae of Caesar Augustus rebuilt because he was such a big fan of it. And before World War II started, they actually dined together in this dining room of the Medici Palace, which is kind of scary. So if you're looking at this, if you didn't know any better, you may think for a second this is a Roman villa, because it looks like the House of the Veti that we've looked at before. But that was done on purpose. The interior was modeled off of those classical Greek and Roman villas, or Roman villas, and the outside was based on the power of the Colosseum. So the one they picked for the 250 for you to know is called the Palazzo Rusellae, all right? And the Palazzo Rusellae definitely has that look of the Colosseum to it. And you can see here, because not only does it have the 3 levels, it also has the 3 levels of columns, or actually these are pilasters. Remember, because they don't have to be supportive, so why waste the material of actually using engaged columns? These are pilasters that are flat with a capital on the top of it. So you can see here at the bottom, the most simple at the bottom, so Doric, and then Ionic, and then Corinthian all the way up at the top. And you have the void over void. So you have windows over windows over windows, just like you have in the Colosseum. So the outside of this was meant to be intimidating and classical and show the strength of the Roman past, that this represents that. But then the interior of it would be the basically look like a Roman villa, essentially. So this is the interior. You can see like the cubiculi, and today it's actually used as a school for the arts, which is kind of incredible that they've turned it into that. You can see the frescoes on the interior, how pretty those are. And this is, this just kills me, because what you're looking at here on the left is actually the crest above on the keystone, and you can see the pilasters really well too, but you can see the keystone that would have had sails on it, which were like the crest of the Rusellae family. But this is the porch of the Palazzo Rusellae that you can see here, that would have been used like almost for the stables across the street. And you can see that it's got the pilasters, and it's got those barrel vaults and the Corinthian columns, and today they have put glass in it, and it is a Bang & Olufsen technology store, and it just absolutely destroys me that this is what they've turned it into, and that they just couldn't restore the integrity. So you've got the Palazzo Rusellae, and then like the stables and the other extension of the building across the street. So you can see the rustication also zooming in on it, so you can see that tough and rough exterior kind of giving that message of strength, along with the 3 stories like the Colosseum. All right, so we are now done with the Italian Renaissance, and we will move on to the Northern Renaissance before finishing this semester.